All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is our fourth week into our 5-week-long study entitled Who is Jesus? And what we've been studying is we've been studying the historical evidence for the Christian faith, the historical evidence for Jesus being God, studying the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, for the Gospels being historically reliable. We've been going through the study trying to answer from the perspective of a skeptic, who is Jesus? Okay, who is this guy? This is the most important person to ever live in history. Who is this guy? What's the story on this guy? And so what we've been doing is we've been going over 5 statements that I make that I think if you understand these 5 statements, can provide evidence for these 5 statements, and know how to apply these 5 statements, you can demonstrate beyond any reasonable certainty that Jesus is, in fact, God. The first statement that we talked about is that Jesus is a knowable figure in history. The same way that we know that Abraham Lincoln existed or that Julius Caesar existed, Jesus existed. Then we talked about how the 4 New Testament Gospels are historically reliable sources for the life of Jesus. We dated the Gospels, figured out their authorship. We talked about whether they have historical and archaeological confirmation. We talked about whether they corroborate each other or contradict each other, whether we have trustworthiness in the authors. And we showed that the 4 New Testament Gospels are historically reliable sources for the life of Jesus. Once we found Jesus in history, we found the historical documents on him. We then asked the question who he claimed to be, and I showed you that Jesus claimed to be God. But these last 3 weeks have really been the setup for the last 2 weeks that we're going to start this week and next week, where we're really showing the evidence of who Jesus is. These first 3 statements are really, really basic and simple. And you might be surprised to hear that anyone would ever question these statements like, yes, Jesus existed. Like, that's not that extraordinary of a claim to know that the most influential man in history existed. Like, obviously he existed. The 4 New Testament Gospels are historically reliable. When they say that this person went to this place, it really happened. Like, that's very, very basic. Jesus claimed to be God. Oh, the most famous religious figure that ever lived claimed to be God. Like, yeah, that makes sense. But what we're really getting into now in our last 2 classes are the really, really extraordinary claims that we would make as Christians, okay? In our last class, we talked about how Jesus claimed to be God. Now, anyone can claim to be God, okay? That's not, we don't bow down and worship someone because they claim to be God, okay? I don't know if you ever heard the story of the patient in the mental asylum that thought that he was Napoleon. And the doctor's talking to him, and he says, he says, who are you? He says, I'm Napoleon. And he has his hand in his jacket pocket. I'm Napoleon. And the psychologist asks, how do you know that you're Napoleon? And he says, God told me that I'm Napoleon. And the guy next door yells out, I did not. But anyone can claim to be anything. I can claim to be God. The question is, do you have any evidence to back it up? And what we're going to be looking at in the next 2 weeks, over the next 2 classes, is do we have evidence that Jesus really is God, really is who he says he is? And what we're going to be talking about in this class is that there is powerful historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. That is an extraordinary claim. That someone rose from the dead is an extraordinary enough claim, but that we have evidence that this person rose from the dead, and we still have historical evidence 2,000 years after. That's an incredible statement, okay? But I think we have enough reasons to back that up, and I'll present my case today. And next class, we're going to be talking about something, if you could imagine something more amazing than that, we're going to be talking about an even more amazing evidence for Jesus, and that being that his life, death, and resurrection fulfilled many prophecies written hundreds or even thousands of years before he was born. And we'll talk about why that's important, why that's really, really important to this case. At the end of this class, we'll lead into this. But the statement that I'm going to make today, and I'm going to defend today, is that there is powerful historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus staked his claim that he was God on him rising from the dead. Jesus claimed this is how he was going to prove that he really was who he says he was. Jesus is quoted in the book of Matthew. It says, "But he answered and said unto them," he's talking to some of the people that were skeptical of him at the time. He says, "An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign." They want evidence for who I am. He says, "And there shall be no sign given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus predicted his own death multiple times in the Gospels. And he said, "This is how you know that I'm God. I'm going to die, and then 3 days later I'm going to rise again from the dead." And so this is him calling his shot and making it. Okay, and the case that I'm going to present today is that he made it. He backed it up. And this resurrection is central to the Christian doctrine. Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, he says, "And if Christ be not risen, then our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain." What that means is that everything you do at this church is completely and utterly worthless if Jesus did not rise from the dead. That is an amazing statement that Paul is making. Okay? There's nothing more important to Jesus than his resurrection, to prove that he really is who he says he is. The resurrection makes Christianity unique among all religions. All but 4 of the major world religions are based on mere philosophical propositions. They're nothing to do with history or any historical person. Of the 4 that are based on personalities rather than a philosophical system, only Christianity claims an empty tomb for its founder. Abraham, founder of Judaism, died in 1900 BC. Buddha died and buried according to their own documents. When Buddha died, it was with the utter passing away in which nothing whatever remains behind. He is dead and he is gone. Muhammad died on June 8th, 632 AD. There is no major religion that claims that their head figure rose from the dead. This makes Jesus unique. Here is a teacher of religion, and he calmly professed to stake his entire claims upon his ability, after having been done to death, to rise again from the grave. We may safely assume that there never was, before or since, such a proposal made. He who was ready to stake everything on his ability to come back from the tomb stands before us as the most original of all teachers, one who shines in his own self-evidencing life. Jesus predicts his death, he predicts his resurrection, and then he dies, and then he rises again from the dead. This is also profoundly important to our lives and to our Christian faith, because the consequence of the resurrection is incomparable to anything else. It is the concrete, factual, empirical proof that life has hope and meaning, that love is stronger than death, goodness and power are ultimately allies, not enemies. Life wins in the end. God has touched us right here where we are and has defeated our last enemy. We are not cosmic orphans, as our modern secular worldview would make us, and these existential consequences of the resurrection can be seen by comparing the disciples before and after. Before, they ran away, denied their master, and huddled behind locked doors in fear and confusion. After this, they were transformed from scared rabbits into confident saints, world-changing missionaries, courageous martyrs, and joy-filled touring ambassadors for Christ. Now, I think that it is very, very easy to deny the resurrection of Jesus as long as you ignore the historical evidence for it. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present the historical evidence for Jesus, for the resurrection of Jesus. There's a bunch of work that has been done on this. One of the terms that gets thrown around is what's called the minimal facts argument. And the minimal facts argument basically says, here are the basic facts of the events of first century Israel. Here are the basic facts of what's going on with Jesus and the religious leaders in Rome and what's happening with Jesus' crucifixion and all this stuff. They give, here's the basic facts that all historians agree on, and let's build the Christian case off of this. And usually the minimal facts argument argues that we're going to take even what the skeptics admit. which I actually think is a wrong thing to do. I'd say take a maximal facts argument, is to give all the evidence that we know, whether or not skeptics will admit it or not. But what we're going to do is we're going to go over, and obviously there's a lot of detail that you can read in the Gospels. There's a lot of detail that you can study through studying history about Jesus and his death, and kind of the cultural what's going around in the culture and in society at that time that kind of confirms the details of this. There's a lot that you could study. We're going to cover some of the basics. And what we're going to do is, in order to see whether or not we have sufficient evidence to say that Jesus rose from the dead, what we're going to do is I'm going to present you the evidence that we know, the facts of history that we know, and then I'm going to say, what explanations are there? Okay, obviously there's the resurrection, but if we wanted to give an alternate explanation, that his disciples stole the body, or they just hallucinated that he was still alive, or let's give an alternate explanation, an alternate natural explanation, and see if we can explain the details of history. And I maintain that there is no alternate explanation for the resurrection of Jesus that does not either ignore the evidence, outright deny the evidence, completely make up new evidence, and completely make up just ad hoc things to add on to the historical evidence that we have. I do not think there is anything that fits with the evidence that would be an alternate explanation to the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' resurrection explains the evidence more than anything else. And so when we look at the historical facts to be explained, one of the major kind of tentpole umbrella facts that we need to understand is Jesus' death by crucifixion. It is a historical fact that Jesus died was by crucifixion in the first century. The historical evidence of Jesus' death by crucifixion includes the testimonies of the Roman historian Tacitus, the Jewish historian Josephus, and the Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata. The eyewitness testimony of all four Gospels claim that Jesus was crucified and that he died on the cross. Pilate commissioned the Roman centurion to verify that Jesus was in fact dead. Pilate is the Roman in charge, and he commissioned his Roman centurion to verify that Jesus had died. In Mark 15, it says, "And Pilate marveled if he were already dead, and calling unto him the centurion, he asked whether he had been any while dead. And when he had knew it of the centurion, then he gave his body to Joseph." We'll talk about Joseph in a minute. Pilate had to confirm that Jesus had died, and so he did so with the centurion, the Roman commander that was watching over this event. There's an amazing verse in the book of John where John is giving his testimony. John was physically there at the crucifixion, and he's giving this testimony. He says, "Then came the soldiers and brake the legs." This is after Jesus has died. "The soldiers came and brake the legs of the first and of the other who were crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they brake not his legs. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water." This is an amazing medical detail, because this is medically accurate of how someone would die by suffocation, essentially. So when you are crucified, we say that they are hung on a cross, and you are literally, quite literally, hung on the cross. Your entire body weight collapses down onto you, and you have to pull yourself up to be able to breathe, which is obviously very painful if you are nailed to a cross. Crucifixion was obviously very brutal and vicious and torturous death. And what we have from the Journal of the American Medical Association did an analysis of Jesus' death based on the historical evidence. And they said it was quite obvious to them that Jesus was suffering from hypothalamic shock from his beatings, which is why he wasn't able to carry his cross, why they had to get Simon of Cyrene to carry his cross for him. So this is evidence that he had hypothalamic shock. And then when the water comes out, it was evidence that they had pierced his lung, and water was coming out, which is proof that he died from exhaustion, asphyxia. And it concludes by saying that modern medical interpretations of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when he was taken down from the cross. Now, this section in John is amazing for many reasons, but just looking at this one from the evidence for Jesus' death, this is a medical condition that could not have been faked. There's no way that Jesus was a really good magician and faked this, that this is not something you could fake, and a detail that a writer could not have known to make up. You say, John's lying, he wasn't actually there, this is all made up later. How in the world is a first century fisherman going to know that if you die from hypervolemic shock and exhaustion asphyxia, how in the world would you know that water is going to come out of the lung? And so, because this is in the Bible, just by the pure fact that it is stated in the Bible, we know that this happened. Because if it didn't happen, no one would have known to make it up. We know that this came from eyewitness testimony, so we know that the writer of this gospel was there. And we know that Jesus really died on the cross because you couldn't fake it. And so we can add that to our evidences involved in Jesus' death by crucifixion. Now, we also have evidences in history that Jesus was buried in a tomb. This is, of course, recorded in all 4 gospel accounts. We see in the Gospels that he was buried by a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who was secretly a supporter of Jesus. And this is actually interesting because it's an embarrassing detail that the gospel writers probably wouldn't have made up, that Jesus' disciples were scared and ran away, but the member of the Sanhedrin, who was the group that chose to kill Jesus, was the one that was there to bury him. That's an embarrassing detail that they wouldn't be able to make up. And it's something that if you were making up a story, you wouldn't put Jesus in your narrative. You wouldn't put him in the hands of your opponents. Because if you said, oh, Jesus was buried in their tomb, they could just go and say he wasn't buried in the tomb. If he was buried in the tomb and Jesus was still there, while they're saying that he rose again from the dead, they can go to their own tomb and say, Jesus is still here. Okay? So this is putting the evidence in the hands of your opponents. And we know a lot of details about Jesus' burial. We know more about the burial of the Lord Jesus than we know of the burial of any significant character in all of ancient history. We know infinitely more about his burial than we do of the burial of any Old Testament character, or of any king of Babylon, Pharaoh of Egypt, or philosopher of Greece, or triumphant Caesar. We know who took his body from the cross. We know something of the wrapping of the body in spices and burial clothes. We know the very tomb in which his body was placed, the name of the man who owned it, Joseph of a town known as Arimathea. We know even where the tomb was located, in a garden near the place where he was crucified outside the city walls. We have 4 records of this burial for our Lord, all of them in amazing agreement. So we have plenty of details about Jesus' burial, more so than we would about anybody else at this time. One of the interesting things is that the women who were supporting Jesus actually witnessed the burial of Jesus. They were there overlooking this, so they knew where Jesus was buried. So we have a lot of detail about Jesus' burial. What we also have is this interesting aspect of Jesus' burial, and that is that his opponents at the time also indicated that he was in fact buried. We see the Jewish response to Jesus' resurrection. We see it presented in the Bible, actually. We see it presented in Matthew 27. It says, "Now the next day that followed, the day after the crucifixion, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that the deceiver said, while he was alive, after 3 days I will rise again." Which is interesting that they understood what Jesus said, but a lot of his disciples didn't understand and have enough faith, but they really did. His opponents did. "And they said, Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead. So the last error will be worse than the first." He says, if they steal his body, then situation is going to get even worse for us. "And so Pilate said unto them, You have your watch, go your way, make it as sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch." The Roman seal was put on the tomb, which if you broke the Roman seal, that was punishable by death. And they set a watch of probably 4 soldiers in front of the tomb. And so I like to say that the resurrection of Jesus has the Roman stamp of approval on it. What's interesting about this presentation, there's a couple interesting things about this argument that is put forward. The Jewish argument, as presented in the Gospel of Matthew, is that the disciples stole the body from Jesus. That's what the common Jewish argument at the time was, that, the tomb was empty, but the disciples stole the body. And you can see this in more than just the Bible. We see in early Christian apologetics made by Tertullian and Justin Martyr, we see that they are arguing with Jewish people who are claiming the disciples stole the body, and these early Christian disciples are saying how this isn't possible, as I'll show you in a minute. But what's interesting is that this is the Jewish argument. Now, the Jewish argument to explain away the resurrection is that the disciples stole the body. That admits that the body was buried in a tomb, and it also admits that the tomb was found empty. Okay? So that's enemy attestation that, yes, these events really did happen. Jesus really was buried in a tomb, and the tomb was really found empty. And so this is one of the ways that we would know that the tomb was actually empty. Okay, or that Jesus was actually buried and the tomb was actually empty. The third fact that I've already talked about is that the tomb was found empty. We know this according to all four Gospels, that the tomb was found empty, and we also know that because of the Jewish response to it. If you say, well, the disciples stole his body out of the tomb, that means that there was a tomb and that the tomb was empty. The fourth fact that that we have, the fourth fact of history that we have to explain, the fourth kind of umbrella fact, there's a lot of detailed facts in each one of these, is that there are multiple accounts from multiple sources that Jesus appeared to many people after his death. This includes to Mary Magdalene individually, to the rest of the women returning from the tomb, to Peter later that day, to two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus, to the apostles without Thomas, and then to the apostles with Thomas, to the 7 by the lake of Tiberias, to a multitude of 500 plus believers of the Galilean mountain, to James, that's Jesus' brother, to the 11 disciples at the ascension, to Paul, to Stephen in the book of Acts, to Paul in the temple in the book of Acts, and to the apostle John at Patmos. So these reported sightings of Jesus after his death represent hundreds of eyewitnesses told by 5 different authors in 6 different texts. Okay, that's a lot of historical evidence. Consider the fact that this is 2,000 years ago, and we still have hundreds of eyewitnesses from 5 different authors in 6 different texts demonstrating that people saw Jesus, had large groups of people seeing Jesus after he had died. One of the other facts of history that we need to take into account is that there was this radical transformation of people who encountered the resurrected Jesus. One of the groups of people that we would need to look at are the disciples themselves. The disciples, when Jesus was crucified, all ran away. Most of them, at least, ran away. Peter, who's kind of the head of the disciples, he denied knowing Jesus 3 times and ran and hid for fear of the Jewish authority. But then, after this event, they have a complete 180. They are completely different people. Not only do they not run from persecution, they run towards persecution. Okay, they are 100% adamant that Jesus rose from the dead, and they will die, and they did die, almost all of them, by stating that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. But it's not only the disciples that have a complete 180. It's also the enemies of Jesus, including 3 of the authors of the New Testament. Paul was an enemy of Jesus during his lifetime. We don't know whether he personally knew him or not, but he was one of the religious leaders at the time who, even after Jesus' resurrection, he hadn't seen him yet, after Jesus' resurrection, he goes around persecuting Christians, looking for Christians to persecute, which is why in one of his letters he talks about how he is the chief among sinners, because he's the worst person that's ever lived because of what he did here. But in an encounter with Jesus, an encounter with what he believed was Jesus, he completely changed his life around, completely gave up everything he knew, joined the people he was persecuting, and did so to his death. And we have plenty of historical evidence for his death. And so this is a complete 180 from this guy. We also have 2 more of the New Testament writers, James and Jude. James and Jude were brothers of Jesus, but the Gospels record that his brothers didn't believe him. They thought he was crazy. They actually tried to stop his ministry. They came to his ministry and said, "Come home, like you're a lunatic." But they were enemies of Jesus all throughout his quote unquote life. Okay, Jesus makes it a little more complicated to say during his lifetime, because whole resurrection business. But during his lifetime, James and Jude were enemies to him, and later converted, became Christians and leaders of the Christian church, and obviously writers of the New Testament. But they actually saw a risen Jesus and had a complete 180 in their life. Now, one of the fifth fact that I want to bring up, fifth kind of major fact, is that all of this information comes from early and in Jerusalem. So at the time and at the place of the event, these teachings were not invented 500 years later. Okay, we know the growth of the early church. Josephus talks about how both Jews and Gentiles to his day, which is in the first century, were supporting Jesus. We know that Tacitus and Suetonius both have Christians in Rome by the time that they're writing. That's pretty fast to move across the world like that. Pliny the Younger says that in the first century, Jesus was already being worshipped as God. Lucian of Samosata talks about what the Christians believe, and he says this is what they do to this day. We have very, very early attestation, and this is a weird one, even before we have anything written down in the Gospels or in any of the New Testament books. There's a section in 1 Corinthians 15 that is widely accepted that this is a early Christian creed that Paul writes down, but is a saying that Christians would use to deliver information from one person to another. This predates anything written in the Bible. It's written in the Bible, but this was said by Christians earlier as a creed. And it says, "For I delivered unto you, I, Paul, delivered unto you first of all that which I also received." And he gives this teaching. How that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. We'll talk about that next week. That he was buried, and that he rose again from the third day according to the Scriptures. That he was seen of Cephas, Peter, then of the 12. After that he was seen above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this day, but some are fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and last he was seen of me also, as one born out of due time. And this predates anything written in the Bible, which we showed that the Gospels were written early and in the time of his disciples. And so we have early attestation, but not only early attestation for everything, but we see all of this information coming from the time and coming from Jerusalem. So we know that these teachings were presented in a place where, if it was wrong, everyone would know it was wrong. Okay? If someone lied about what was happening in this town, you would know that they're lying because you live here. So those are the evidences that we have, and so I would like to kind of summarize that by saying the church didn't start the belief in the resurrection. Belief in the resurrection started the church, is kind of a way of summarizing that. But we have a lot of evidences that we have to go through to explain, and I have to explain as a Christian, and if I was a skeptic, I have to explain as a skeptic. Okay, how do you put all these facts together? Okay. The first and most obvious explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. If I'm claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, how do I explain all of these details? Well, the historical evidence suggests that he died, get this, because he died. Okay? 1 equals 1. Okay? 1 equals 1. It's very, very simple. Okay? The historical record shows that he was buried in a tomb because he was buried in a tomb. No mental gymnastics has to be taken in order to get around this. Jesus' tomb was found empty because he rose from the dead. Many sources claimed that many people saw him alive because he had come back to life and visited them. The disciples told of Jesus' resurrection from the dead because they believed it was the truth, and they died for what they thought to be true, because it was true. His opponents became believers because they saw him risen from the dead. And it started in Jerusalem because that's where it happened. 1 equals 1. It's like the most basic, straightforward presentation of it. But if you're a skeptic of Christianity, you have a problem with this. Okay, you don't want to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, because if he rose from the dead, that kind of means Jesus is really who he claimed to be. That means that he's God. And if he's God, I went through all the implications in our first class. If he's God, then Christianity is true. If he's God, then atheism is false. If he's God, and he says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, then all other religions are false. Okay? If he's God, and he says that the Bible is the Word of God, then the Bible is the Word of God. And if he says that if he's God, then what he says has authority over your life. And we really don't want that one as a skeptic, okay? So how do we explain how to explain all this information, these facts of history? How do we explain all these? Okay? Well, what happens if we say that Jesus was still in the tomb? It was all made up by his disciples, okay? Well, in this argument, we accept the fact that he died, and we accept the fact that he was buried in a tomb, so we kind of check both of those boxes. This doesn't explain the empty tomb, because we have plenty of evidence that the tomb was empty, including enemy attestation. And so you have to explain to me why the Jewish authority made up the fact that, yes, Jesus was taken out of our tomb, even though it wasn't true. That doesn't make any sense. Why would the enemies make that up? It doesn't explain the post-resurrection appearances, just to say, I was still in the tomb and it was all made up. We have plenty of eyewitness evidences that Jesus was seen by people. Okay, how do you explain that? Maybe you say, well, they're all lying. They're lying to their death. Like, that doesn't make any sense. People, like we talked about before, there are people that die for lies all the time, but they believe them to be true. The disciples would know, that he was still buried. The people in this area would know that he's still buried. And we'll talk about it as we go through. Conspiracies happen, but the possibility that a conspiracy happened in this instance doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This doesn't explain the disciples' testimony, and it doesn't explain why his opponents became believers. Why did Paul all of a sudden turn around and become like the most prolific Christian writer ever? Literally wrote half the New Testament. How in the world did that happen? Why did his opponents change and change to the point of death? Why did they do that? And it doesn't explain how this started in Jerusalem, because if this happened in Jerusalem, then the people would know that this was a lie. There's kind of another theory that we could throw on top of this that I heard. They say, well, the women went to the wrong tomb. They saw Jesus buried, then they went to the wrong tomb and saw it empty and thought he rose again from the dead. It's like, does that make any sense? Well, first of all, no, it doesn't make any sense, because the women saw where he was buried. And the disciples verified the tomb. Peter and John went to the tomb to verify that this had happened. And at any time, if Jesus was still in the tomb, the Jewish leaders could have produced his body and said, hey, you say he rose again from the dead, but here he is, right here. Okay? This doesn't explain Jesus' appearance to the disciples. It doesn't explain the historical evidence that we see. It doesn't make sense. So the verdict that we would give is that this does not explain the historical facts that we have. Like I said, it is very, very easy to deny the resurrection of Jesus as long as you deny the evidence for it. As long as you start saying, these facts don't count. These facts don't matter. Then you can explain away Jesus' resurrection, but as long as you're doing it with fidelity to the facts, you cannot refute Jesus' resurrection. What if we say that the disciples stole the body? This is the Jewish answer to it. The disciples stole the body. Okay, does that make sense? And the answer is no. So this accepts the fact that he died. It accepts the fact that he was buried in a tomb. But then they say, well, the tomb was empty because the disciples stole the body. And so that's how we explain the empty tomb. This doesn't explain the post-resurrection appearances, including to people that were not his disciples. So including to Paul and James and Jude and others, including people that weren't his disciples and weren't in on it, if this were a conspiracy. It doesn't explain how he was seen by other people. Again, we have to get to the point where the disciples have to die for what they know to be a lie. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that these people would die for something that they knew to be a lie. And we'll get into it. There's no benefit for them in doing this. This doesn't explain why his opponents, Paul and Jesus' brothers, became believers. And it doesn't explain how it started in Jerusalem, because the lie could have been discovered there. In addition, they have to get past the Roman guard. The disciples have to get past the Roman guard. I don't know how they do that, okay? And the argument that was given by the Jewish apologists, the early anti-Christian apologists, is they said that the soldiers fell asleep, and the disciples came by when the soldiers were sleeping. Well, first of all, what happens to a Roman soldier if he falls asleep on duty? He's killed. Off with your head, okay? Second of all, if you're asleep, how do you know it happened? Okay? It's a bizarre thing to say, while I was asleep, my neighbor came in and took my TV. If you were asleep, how'd you know it was him? Okay? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like what's interesting is the way it's presented. It's the story, as it's presented in Matthew, is so obviously false that Matthew doesn't even bother to refute it. Okay? That's how ridiculous it is. So what we have is this claim that the disciples were a part of this big conspiracy. Now, J. Warner Wallace, in his book Cold Case Christianity, he's a cold case detective, and so he studies murders. And so people that would conspire together to murder someone and then conspire together to cover up the murder. And he says there are a lot of things that have to be true for conspiracies to survive, for conspiracies to actually be successful. And none of these apply to the disciples. So you have to have a small number of conspirators. The more people you have, the more likely one of them is going to admit that this was wrong. And so he can have two people that commit a crime. He separates them, and immediately one of them caves in. Okay? Now, we have 12 disciples. We have hundreds of people that saw him. And all of these people are corroborating each other. Just the 12 is an impossible number, the possibly big number for a conspiracy, for them to all be there. So you have to have a small number of conspirators. They have to have thorough and immediate communication. They have to be able to talk to one another to get their story straight. And so if you separate them, then their story falls apart. And so these guys were separated. They went all over the world spreading this gospel. And there's no evidence that any of them recanted. It has to be over a short time span. But this is happening over at least a decade for a lot of the disciples, and for some of the disciples, for John, multiple decades, because John lived the longest. So you have to have a short time span. You have to have a significant relational connections between all the people. But if you look, these disciples, a lot of them weren't related to each other than the fact that they spent a couple of years with Jesus. And some of them come from very different backgrounds. You literally have a tax collector and a zealot as part of his disciples. They would not have gotten along, okay? A tax collector and a zealot. A zealot being someone who is basically a terrorist, essentially trying to overthrow Rome. And you have to have little or no pressure on the conspiracy to work, okay? So you have to have a small number of conspirators, thorough and immediate communication. You have to have a short time span, significant relational connections between the conspirators, and you have to have little or no pressure. We checked none of these boxes for the disciples, okay? There was a large number of conspirators. They could not communicate with each other because they were separated. There was a long time span that they have to hold this. They have no connections to them outside of their 3 years with Jesus, and there's a ton of pressure. Almost all of them died. Okay, now J. Warner Wallace says, I can't imagine a less favorable set of circumstances for a successful conspiracy than those that the 12 apostles faced. He says, these men and women either were involved in the greatest conspiracy of all time, or were simply eyewitnesses who were telling the truth. The more I learn about conspiracies, the more the latter seemed to be the most reasonable conclusion. He says, the more I understood how conspiracies work, the more you realize these people really believed what they were saying, and it wasn't a conspiracy. What's also interesting that we kind of skip over, and maybe this is a little counterintuitive to some people, Jesus' disciples really didn't have the motive that we might think that they would. They didn't have the motive to, obviously they didn't have the motive to say that, to be teaching what they did because they died, but they didn't have the motive to steal the body. First of all, if Jesus is really, really dead, and that means Jesus was a hoax. Jesus was a scam artist. He was saying that he was God. He was saying he's going to die and rise again. He clearly didn't. And the disciples would have lost hope. There's no reason why they would continue to hitch their wagon with Jesus. And moreover, they wouldn't have disturbed the burial of Jesus because Jesus was actually properly buried. Jesus had he had a rich man's burial. And we'll talk about that next class too, why that's important. But they wouldn't have disturbed his burial. I like the way that this phrases it. It says, the enemies of Jesus had no motive for removing the body, and the friends of Jesus had no power to do so. And I would say that all motives to lie about Jesus' resurrection died with him. If Jesus is dead, then our faith is in vain, as Paul talks about, and that's what his disciples would have understood. Now, how else could we explain? So that doesn't work, the idea that the disciples stole the body. But let's try another one then. Okay, if that doesn't work, let's just throw out as many possibilities as we can. What if we say that Jesus didn't really die on the cross? Okay, Jesus was on the cross, he passed out, and woke up 3 days later. Now, this explains that he was buried in a tomb, because it still says that he was buried in a tomb. It explains why the tomb was empty, because he woke up from his little nap, because apparently the crucifixion does that, it just gives you a nap. We have many sources that claim they saw him alive because he was still alive, and they just thought he had died and rose again. The disciples truly, and this is one of the reasons why people take this, is because it's hard to explain why the disciples why all 12 of them would have died for a lie and had this big conspiracy. Well, in this case, if Jesus passed out and woke up, they think he rose again from the dead, they really believe it. Okay, they're mistaken in this instance. If this is true, they're mistaken, but they really believe it, and so it explains the sincerity of the disciples. This even explains his opponents converting, because they think he rose again from the dead too. Paul thinks he rose again from the dead. James and Jude think he rose again from the dead. That would convince me to think that he's God. It did convince me to think he's God because he rose from the dead. It explains why it started in Jerusalem, but what this doesn't explain is the evidence for Jesus' death. First of all, it doesn't explain how, like we talked about water coming out of Jesus when he was speared, it doesn't explain that. It doesn't explain the medical condition that the medical verification that we have of Jesus' death. It doesn't explain why the disciples would have thought that he really overcame death, because if you were a crucifixion victim, you would not, even if you survived by some, I don't even know how, even if you survived, you wouldn't give off the appearance that you were a confident commander of destroying death. You would have been beaten and bloodied, and if you survived, you would not have shown the confidence to make these people believe that you had actually risen from the dead and defeated death. So it explains the post-resurrection experiences people had with Jesus, because after he woke up, then they saw him. But it really doesn't explain them all. Okay, I don't know how you explain this one. In Luke 24, you guys are studying the book of Luke. You'll get there in a couple weeks or a couple months. But at the end of the book of Luke, it records that Jesus appeared to two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. And it said when they were journeying from Jerusalem, which is about 80 furlongs, that's about 7 miles from Emmaus to Jerusalem, it says that Jesus himself appeared to them. They didn't recognize Jesus. God had made it so that they wouldn't recognize who he was. We don't fully understand why, but they didn't recognize it was Jesus. And Jesus is like, hey, what's wrong, guys? And they're like, oh, Jesus just died. And of course they don't know, but Jesus is standing right there. And Jesus starts talking to them about all the scriptures that were fulfilled. How this had to happen. This was supposed to happen because of all the scriptures that have to be fulfilled. Which is kind of what we're going to talk about next week, but I would have rather heard Jesus lecture on it than hear mine next week. Just Jesus probably gave a better lecture on it than I will next week. And then it says, and their eyes were open and they knew him, and then he vanished out of their sight. And they rose the same hour and returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 gathered. They said, hey, Jesus is alive. We got to go tell his disciples. They run back to Emmaus, 7 miles down the road. And they get there, tell his disciples, hey, Jesus is alive, and they realize Jesus is sitting with his disciples. How is someone that was just crucified, that somehow survived, able to run 7 miles back to the disciples before the other disciples got there? Like, how in the world is this happening? It is completely implausible that a crucifixion victim that by some unusual circumstances survived, after days of no medical attention, unwound his own grave clothes, moved the stone out of the way, snuck past the Roman guards, traveled 7 miles to Emmaus on nail-scarred feet to see some of his followers, then snuck out of their camp and outran them back to Jerusalem and made it to the disciples before them. I find that unlikely, okay? So that doesn't work. How else would we explain it? Well, maybe we explain it by saying that Jesus' resurrection was just hallucinations. The people that saw Jesus were just hallucinating. okay? Because people do hallucinate stuff, okay? That does happen. So what if that happens? Well, this explains, okay, Jesus died. We accept the evidence for his death. We accept the evidence that he was buried in a tomb. It doesn't explain the empty tomb, because the Jews still have to lie and say the tomb is empty, when they could have just produced the body and say, hey, here he is. You thought you saw him on the market the other day, but here he is. This does explain why many sources claim many people saw him alive, because they hallucinated them. But the problem is that hallucinations don't happen in groups. And one of the things about Jesus' appearance is that not all of them, but most of them happened in groups, where multiple people saw Jesus at the same time. And multiple people don't hallucinate. If you hallucinate, it's just you. It's in your own mind. It's not actually happening. What this also doesn't explain, it doesn't explain why his opponents would have switched to being with supporting Jesus also. So you're saying, oh, well, Peter really, really loved Jesus, and when he died, he hallucinated that he saw him the next day. Okay, fine. Why'd Paul hallucinate him? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, Paul was an enemy of Jesus. Okay, he was persecuting the Christians at this time. Why would he have hallucinated him? Why would James or Jude, who thought that Jesus was a lunatic, why would they have hallucinated him? Okay, and because it doesn't explain the empty tomb, it doesn't explain why this started in Jerusalem, because everyone would have pointed out that he was still in the tomb. This would have been debunked. J. Warner Wallace, the cold case guy, said, as a detective, I frequently encountered witnesses who were related to some way in the victim in my case, but I've never encountered loved ones who have collectively imagined an identical set of fictional events involving the victim. This doesn't work. You don't have mass hallucinations. And one of the other things about hallucinations is a lot of people have hallucinated someone dying, and they've hallucinated seeing them later. But even when they do, they don't conclude that they've come back from the dead. They conclude that, I was hallucinating them, or they conclude, something spiritual, but they don't conclude that they physically came back from the dead. Okay? Maybe we say that, this is another one that I hear, that Jesus was buried in a mass grave. He wasn't buried in a tomb. Okay? This one accepts that he dies, and I guess it accepts that this started in Jerusalem, but it doesn't explain just about anything else. This doesn't explain the evidence that we have for Jesus' tomb or his empty tomb. This is, again, something that the Jewish authority would have had to have made up. Even though he was buried in a mass grave, they made up the fact that he was buried in a tomb and that the tomb was found empty. It doesn't explain the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. It doesn't explain why his opponents became believers. It doesn't explain anything. But one of the reasons why people say this, that Jesus was buried in a mass grave, if you ever heard that one before, is that a lot of times, in most instances, crucifixion victims weren't given proper burial, and so they were normally just thrown in mass graves. And so people say that probably happened with Jesus. He was just buried in a mass grave. It doesn't explain any of the other evidence that we see. It really doesn't explain any evidence that we see, to be quite honest with you. But they say that just because, generally speaking, that's what happened in Rome. Well, what they don't admit is that there was instances where Rome would allow people to be buried honorably, mostly because they're trying to make peace with the people at the time. Like, the Romans want complete authority, but they also want peace in their empire, and so a lot of times they would work with the people in that area and say, they would concede things to them. And one of the things that they conceded, and we have plenty of historical evidence for this, is, according to the Old Testament, you were not allowed to have people hanging on crosses. You weren't allowed to leave them up there for days because it would defile the land. This is in Deuteronomy 21. It says, and if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain up all night on the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, and thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. You're not allowed to leave someone hanging. And the Jewish people were very, very adamant that the bodies of crucified victims were buried and were not left up hanging. So Jesus wouldn't have been hanging up there for days, as these people would have argued. And people were very, very skeptical of this claim that there were going to be crucifixion victims that were buried. And for a long time, people said this is proof that your gospel is made up history because crucifixion victims weren't buried. Ha, 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 ha. Then they find archaeological evidence. They actually find the bones of a crucifixion victim properly buried with the nail still stuck in it. They usually take the nails out, but they couldn't because the nail was stuck in the bone. And so we actually have evidence of a crucifixion victim that was nailed and was properly buried. Okay? This one guy in his book tried to argue for a mass grave. He says, the truth is that we do not know, and in all probability the disciples knew no better, where the body of Jesus had been thrown after it had been removed from the cross, probably by the executioners. It is more likely to have been cast in a pit for the executed than laid in a new tomb. And this one critic of him, who I think reasonably pointed out, he says, he denies the fact which the four Gospels clearly set forth that the body of Jesus was placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, denying that his presence presents no evidence to contradict it, but makes a statement which proceeds out of his own imagination. In fact, one would say that his statement about the body of Jesus proceeds not only from his imagination, but from his preconceived philosophical, non-historical prejudices. And so this also doesn't make sense of the evidence. It's really just an ad hoc thing where they take a general case of what's happening in the Roman Empire, which is like half the world. It takes this general case and tries to apply it to a specific scenario, but all the evidence we have is that Jesus was buried. There is no alternate explanation for Jesus' resurrection. There's no evidence, there's no explanation for all of these facts other than Jesus really did rise again from the dead. Every single counter story about what happened that a skeptic would use to argue away, well, this is really what happened. You think that he rose from the dead, but this is really what happened. None of them make any historical sense. They're all nonsensical, completely nonsensical. And this is why most skeptics, when they're pressed, will not give a counterexample. Okay? They just won't. They might try to pick at yours, but they don't give a counterexample. The smart ones, when they debate, don't put their reputation on saying, oh yeah, Jesus was obviously buried in a mass grave. Oh yeah, the disciples obviously stole the body, because it really doesn't make much sense. This guy, George Hansen, said, the simple faith of the Christian who believes the resurrection is nothing compared to the credulity of the skeptic who will accept the wildest and most improbable romances rather than admit the plain witness of historical certainties. The difficulties of belief may be great, the absurdities of unbelief are greater. And so I think it's completely reasonable to say that all these alternate explanations that anyone over the past 2,000 years has ever tried to put forward, none of them make historical sense. It's all nonsense, okay? But there's one objection left, okay? We've gone through a lot in our Sunday school series. We've gone over people saying that Jesus never existed, that the Gospels, we don't know who wrote the Gospels, they're historically unreliable. We've gone through, Jesus never claimed to be God. We've gone through all of these, Jesus was buried in a mass grave, the disciples stole the body, the disciples lied, and we've gone through all of that. There's one objection remaining, and that is this, and this is something that I pointed out to you in our second class, if you remember back. The final objection that we would give is they would say, yes, every single counter-explanation is completely historically unlikely, completely unreasonable, but the most unlikely explanation is that it was a miracle that Jesus rose again from the dead. Yeah, conspiracies, obviously, this is not a good candidate for conspiracy, but no matter how improbable a conspiracy is, it's more probable than someone rising from the dead. I mean, how often do you see that? Okay? They'll say that a miracle by definition is the least improbable. Bart Ehrman, in his book, Jesus Interrupted, he says, historians can establish only what probably happened in the past, but miracles, by their very nature, are always the least probable explanations for what happened. And so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how improbable all of those things, all of those counterexamples are, all of them are more probable than the resurrection. However, there is one final piece of evidence that we have for who Jesus really is. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next class. And that is that hundreds or even thousands of years before Jesus was born, there were prophecies given about the Messiah, so many and so specific that no human being could fulfill them all without being the Messiah. This flips the probability argument on its head. And it shows the resurrection not as a random suspension of natural laws, but as a planned, predictable, and probable event. And that's why our fifth statement is so important to demonstrating who Jesus is, because there's that one objection left. It's the most improbable, they're all of those alternate examples, they're all improbable. But the most improbable is the resurrection. And what we're going to do next week is we're going to flip it on its head. To flip the probability argument on its head and say, what's the probability that anyone would be able to fulfill all of these prophecies of the life of Jesus? Because they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a miracle is. A miracle isn't, I was driving down the street one day and the car next to me just floated up into space because gravity just stopped working. That's how they perceive a miracle. A miracle is an intentional intervention by God that was planned for literally thousands of years. And it was predicted. It's going to happen. Here's the time. Here's the place. Here's the man. Here's the events. Here's the details. And it all happened. It was all probable. And that's what we're going to talk about next week in my fifth statement, that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection fulfilled many prophecies written hundreds or thousands of years before he was born. But that concludes our class today, and we will conclude our series next week. But does anyone have any thoughts, comments, questions?